Good morning, students. Today we continue with our discussions on Orientalism. The last classes we were talking about Edward Said, and then we discussed these questions like what does Orientalism say, why does Orientalism matter, and why read this text, etc. And then we moved to the author's background, and later we talked about the influences of the concepts of Foucault, Gramsci, Derrida in his work. And then we talked about the major ideas in this text in general. And then we moved to the introduction part. So we were basically trying to understand the term Orientalism. And Orientalism is actually a term which is used for the imitation or depiction of aspects of Eastern cultures in the West by writers, designers, and artists. It is simple as that. It is something like a primary definition. And in the 19th century, it was used for all those people who did, all those scholars who did Oriental studies. Orientalist is a person who did all those Oriental studies. And it was in 20th century we see a considerable change in the terms usage. We have this particular work, Orientalism by Edward Said, and here he used this term to describe all those Western tradition, which can be both academic and artistic, which give out a prejudiced outsider interpretations of the East, which is actually shaped by the attitudes of European imperialism in the 18th and 19th centuries. And in this introduction part, he tries to introduce and explain what he means by the term Orientalism before he goes on to analyze the various manifestations of the meaning in various texts. So he begins, as I said in my last class, he begins by talking about an anecdote by a French journalist who talks about the destruction of Beirut in a lamenting voice, and this is what he says, that it had once seemed to belong to the Orient of Chateaubriand and Nerval. So we understand that even then they can't identify with the reality of the Beirut. So even then you are giving out a romanticized perception of Beirut, and it is actually how the Orient is an imagined reality. It is still the European imagination about the Orient which matters. It is not the contemporary fate of the people who are actually living there still matters. So this particular quote sets the context for Edward Say's argument, and he addresses these questions like why Orient is special to Europe. So Orientalism, as he says, is a way of coming to terms with the Orient, and it has a special place in the Europeans' experience because it is not only an adjacent place to Europe, it is one of the richest and greatest and oldest colonies, and it is one of the important lines which says that it is one of its deepest and most recurring images of the other. It is how Europe defined themselves. Europe defined themselves as the contrasting image, idea, personality, and experience of the Orient. We have discussed all these points, and then we move to the three definitions, three meanings of Orientalism. He gives out three meanings. One is academic definition, the other one is as a style of thought, and the third one is Orientalism as a discourse. So academic definition, it is very simple. It is as it is said, the term refers to the act of studying or otherwise engaging with the Orient. It is just studying language, area, culture, or whatever about the Orient. It is known as Orientalism, and the person who does is known as Orientalist. And second definition, it tries to define it as a style of thought. It is a style of thought based on this philosophical grounds, both on ontological and epistemological distinction, which is made between the Orient and the Occident. And it also looks at the grounds, how this knowledge is produced, treated, and conveyed. And this Orientalism is the knowledge is produced in different grounds. It can be the accounts for the theories, novels, descriptions that the writers in the West have made about the Orient, its people, its customs, its mind, destinies. So this Orientalism can even accommodate the works of Aeschylus, Victor Hugo, Dante, and even Karl Marx. So, all these knowledge produced during this period tried to give out a distinction between the Orient and the Occident. So, that is the second meaning to Orientalism. And then we move to the last meaning and the final meaning, which becomes the core of the discussion of Orientalism as a discourse. So he takes up the idea of Michel Foucault, and he says that it is a Western style for dominating the Orient. It is something like a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, and it tried to make statements about it, authorizing views of it, try to describe it, teach it, settle it, and rule over it. So it is according, when you consider Orientalism as a discourse, it is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So we have discussed, I think we have stopped here in the last class. We will continue. So now he continues with this discussion, Orientalism as a discourse, and he says like it limits Orientalism as a discourse limits our thoughts as well as on Orient. So, but it is necessary we should understand Orientalism as a discourse, because if we cannot understand Orientalism, if we cannot examine Orientalism as a discourse, we will not understand how enormously systematic this discipline is, and how this European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period. So when you only understand Orientalism as a discourse, you will understand it as a systematic discipline. How this Orient was produced in various aspects. So the Orient, as it is said, it was politically produced. It was sociologically produced, it was ideologically produced, even it was scientifically produced. So interestingly, when you talk about all those scientific studies on the Orient, I should quote a certain scientific examination. Like there were a lot of scientific examination on the anatomy of the Orient, the body of the Orient. And for example, there is this strange study where the skull of an Oriental person, mainly it was, I think it was an African person. So the skull size of this African person will be studied, and they will study the size and shape of the skull, and they ultimately proved that though they had a large sized skull, their brain is actually will be the size of a mustard. So you may think it is very awkward. These kind of studies you may feel that it is very awkward, but it was a kind of a serious study happening during this period. So these were the methods by which the Orient was produced. The Orient produced in double quotes, I should say, by the Occident, and how this Orientalism becomes a systematic discipline. So only if you understand Orientalism as a discourse, you will understand how Europeans were able to manage and produce these type of knowledge about the Orient. And he's trying to say that Orientalism, therefore, was not and is not a free subject of thought or action. It is that is, he is trying to say that Orientalism guides West to see East in certain ways. There are a lot of stereotypes about the Oriental people. When they talk about Arabs, they talk about lazy, cunning Arabs. When they talk about Indians, they use the terms like sexually virile. And when you talk about Indian women, erotic. So these were the stereotypes attached to the Oriental people, and it was it is not all those stereotypes which built this Orientalism. All these things, all these ideas, all these images, all these experiences, everything went on to make Orientalism as a systematic discipline. So he tries to say that Orientalism actually controls our discussions about the Orient, and this is one of the major point. It is the European culture gained in strength. You can see these lines in the textbook. European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self. So here he's trying to suggest that East represents a less evolved stage of civilization, which is which actually appears to exist in a wholly different world and time, and they have and this underground self, or this sort of surrogacy, which gives strength and identity to European culture. What they are not are ours. It is how they define their identity as well, by keeping Orient as a surrogate and their underground self. Now he comes to the second part. We move to the second part of the introduction. It is marked as part 2 in your textbook. Please go through the entire part and then listen to this lecture. So we have finished the first part, where we have the three definitions, and we focused more on the third definition as Orientalism as a discourse. Now we move to the second part. The second part, the major point in the first part itself, he says that Orient is not a natural fact. It is not something which is there. It is something which is man-made. So the first point is that Orient is not an inert fact of nature, which is simply there. It is not merely there, just as the Occident itself is not just there either. So just you must understand that Occident define themselves in contrast to the Orient. So you must understand Orient is something which is man-made, and it was not something which was there, just like Occident, which was not there too. Both these concepts were man-made. And he continues. So I repeat this point. Please go through the text before listening to this lecture and underline the points you see, the major points you see. So these are the lines. What you see in my PowerPoint are the lines from the textbook. I will be giving only the interpretation. So please underline these points in the textbook as well. So he continues, as much as the West itself, Orient is an idea that has a history and a tradition of thought, imagery, and vocabulary that have given it reality and presence in and for the West. So the two geographical entities thus support and to an extent reflect each other. So he is trying to proceed or to give, he's trying to give out greater details about this concept, and he is trying to reinstate this basic argument that the Orient is actually a creation of the Western mind. Orient is actually a creation of the Western mind, and both Orient and Occident are man-made entities. It is not something natural. They are not, as I said earlier, they are not inert fact of nature. So, Orient, and you must understand that this is an idea, Orient is an idea, but it is not just an idea, it has a history, tradition of thought, imagery, vocabulary which has given its reality and presence. It is not a simple idea, but it has a long history and a tradition of thought, imagery, and vocabulary which goes into the making of the Orient. Thus, these two geographical entities support and reflect each other. Reflect in the sense, Orient is what Occident is not, Occident is what Orient is not. So they support and reflect each other. They don't have an independent existence. And here he brings about three qualifications. He adds, so in the first part, he is trying to say that Orient is an idea with lot of history and tradition of thought which goes into the making, and now he adds more points to this concept. Orient is an idea. Hope it is clear. So as I said earlier, there are three qualifications. He says that it is wrong to say that Orient is an idea or creation without any corresponding reality. So when you take this concept of idea is something which is very abstract. There is no concrete reality attached to this term idea. So Edward tries to say that it is completely wrong to say that Orient is an idea or creation without a corresponding reality. He says that there was a reality of people in East, but it was completely different from the perceived Orient by Europe or Orientalist. So we have these famous lines by Disraeli. He says that East is Korea. Here, East mentioned by Disraeli refers to Orient as something which is constructed by the West. So, for all those Europeans during that period, colonial period, East was a career, was a green pasture for them to bloom. So, for them, East was just a career for them. So, it was something which is constructed by the West. So, Disraeli's statement about the East refers mainly to that created consistency. Please remember this word, created consistency, that regular constellation of ideas as the preeminent thing about the Orient, not to its mere being. So he tries to say that Orientalism is not just an idea. In the first part, I said that Orientalism is an idea with a history and tradition of thought. Second, he qualifies, he adds saying that Orientalism is not just an idea, it has a corresponding reality, or rather we should say that there is a brute reality, a cruel reality, which is corresponding to the Westerners' idea of the Orient, Westerners' conception of the Orient, and it is completely ignored. There was this reality of the people who actually lives there. So you get that idea in the first quote itself. So then this French journalist talks about this and this Orient of the Chateaubriand and novel, they completely ignores the actual lived reality of the Orient. So here he says, he adds, Edward Said adds the point that Orientalism is not just an idea; it has a corresponding reality which was completely ignored. That is what you see when this Disraeli talks about East as a career. But the point is that, as I underlined in this PPT, you see that East, there were a lot of ideas generated about the Orient, which was created with lot of consistency, and there was this regular grouping of similar ideas about the Orient. And you should remember these words: consistency and regular constellation of ideas. So let me explain it in Malayalam too. ഇവിടെ പറഞ്ഞു വരുന്നത് ഓറിയന്റലിസം, അടുത്ത പാർട്ടിൽ ഓറിയന്റലിസം ഒരു ഐഡിയ ആണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു. ഐഡിയ ആണ് പറഞ്ഞതിന് ശേഷം ഐഡിയ മാത്രമല്ല, അതിനൊരു കറസ്പോണ്ടിങ് റിയാലിറ്റി ഉണ്ട്. അതായത് ഒരു കൂട്ടം മനുഷ്യർ അത് ജീവിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. ആ ജീവിതം ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് കംപ്ലീറ്റ്ലി ഡിഫറെന്റ് ഫ്രം വാട്ട് യു പെർസീവ്. വാട്ട് യു പെർസീവ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ യൂറോപ്യൻസ് കണ്ട ജീവിതത്തിന്റെ കംപ്ലീറ്റ്ലി ഡിഫറെന്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള റിയാലിറ്റി അവർക്കുണ്ട്. പക്ഷെ ബെഞ്ചമിൻ ഡിസ്രായേലി പോലുള്ള ആൾക്കാർ വരെ ഈസ്റ്റിന് ഒരു കരിയർ എന്നാണ് കണ്ടിരുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ ആ ഒരു കോൺസെപ്റ്റ്സ്, അതുപോലത്തെ പല കോൺസെപ്റ്റ്സ്, പല ഐഡിയാസ് കൂടി ചേർന്നതാണ് ഈ പറയുന്ന ഓറിയന്റ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു ഫിഗർ. അങ്ങനെ ക്രിയേറ്റ് ചെയ്ത ആ ഒരു ഇതിന് ഇറ്റ് ഹാഡ് സം കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് എ കൺസിസ്റ്റൻസി. കൺസിസ്റ്റൻസി എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ എന്താണ്? ഒരാൾ പറയുന്ന ഇപ്പോ കൺസിസ്റ്റൻസി എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഞാനൊരു കാര്യം പറഞ്ഞു, അതുപോലെ തന്നെയുള്ള അതിനോട് ചേരുന്ന വേറൊരു കാര്യം വേറൊരാൾ പറഞ്ഞു. ഇപ്പൊ ഞാൻ ആ അറബിനെ ലേസി എന്ന് വിളിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ അതുപോലെ തന്നെ വേറൊരാള് ഹി ഈസ് എ കണ്ണിങ് പേഴ്സൺ ടു എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നമുക്ക് ഈ ലേസിയോട് ഇങ്ങനെ ആഡ് ചെയ്ത് വെക്കാൻ പറ്റുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങളാണ്. So there is this consistency in the ideas generated, and there is this അങ്ങനെ റെഗുലർ ആയിട്ട് ഈ പറയുന്ന ഐഡിയാസ് ഒന്നിച്ചു വരിക. അത് പല രീതിയിലാകാം. ഇറ്റ് ക്യാൻ ബി നോവലിൽ കൂടെ ആകാം, ഓൾ ദോസ് അഡ്മിനിസ്ട്രേറ്റീവ് പേപ്പേഴ്സിലാവാം, ഗവൺമെന്റ് പേപ്പേഴ്സിലാവാം, അങ്ങനെ സയന്റിഫിക് റിസർച്ച് ആവാം, അങ്ങനെ അതിലെല്ലാം ഈ പറയുന്ന ഓൾ മെയിൻറ്റെയിൻഡ് സം കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് കൺസിസ്റ്റൻസി. ഒരു കൺസിസ്റ്റൻസി ഉണ്ടാവും അവർ തമ്മിലുള്ള ഐഡിയാസ് ജനറേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഹോപ്പ് ഇറ്റ് ഇസ് ക്ലിയർ. So he adds like the Orientalizing. So this process is known as Orientalizing the Orient. What the European does to the Orient is the Orientalizing. The Orientalizing of the Orient did not happen accidentally. It happened because the relationship between the Occident and Orient is in relationship of power and domination of various degrees of complex hegemony. So here is where he takes the concept of Antonio Gramsci. So please read this. The Orient was Orientalized not only because it was discovered to be Oriental in all those ways considered commonplace by an average 19th century European, but also because it could be that is submitted to being made Oriental. So it is the relationship between the Occident and the Orient. അവർ തമ്മിലുള്ള റിലേഷൻഷിപ്പ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് it is the relationship of power and domination. അതിൽ നിന്നാണ് ഈ പറയുന്ന ഓറിയന്റലൈസിങ് ദി ഓറിയന്റ് നടക്കുന്നത്. അല്ലാതെ അതൊരു ആക്സിഡന്റലി ഇന്ന് ഫോർ എക്സാമ്പിൾ ഓൺ എ ഫൈൻ മോർണിംഗ് യു ഗെറ്റ് അപ്പ് ആൻഡ് യു തിങ്ക് ദാറ്റ് ഐ ഷുഡ് ഗിവ് ഔട്ട് ഓൾ ദോസ് സ്റ്റീരിയോടൈപ്സ് അബൌട്ട് ദിസ് ഓറിയന്റ് എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ ഒരു ദിവസം രാവിലെ എണീറ്റ് ആൾക്കാർ ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നൊന്നുമല്ല. അത് എവിടെ നിന്നാണ് വരുന്നത്? ഈ പറയുന്ന റിലേഷൻഷിപ്പ് ഓഫ് പവർ ആൻഡ് ഡോമിനേഷൻ വിച്ച് ഇസ് എ കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് varying degrees of complex hegemony produce this knowledge or produce this or help this process of Orientalizing. So Orient is submitted to being Oriental, because of this varying degrees of complex hegemony. So we will stop here for the time being. Please go through the text. I'll be continuing this lecture. Please read the part 2. We are moving to a serious discussion of Orientalism. Hope it is clear. If you have any doubts, please message me or contact me. And thank you, girls. Have a nice day.